Just as we all know that life isn't fair, we also know that people work for those who pay them. In my last video, I talked about the mixed economy, where good government, responsive to the needs of the people, and private industry created the powerhouse economy of the post-war era, which gave us a middle class growing at rates never seen before. I also mentioned that the problem now is that none of us can trust the government to be good and keep the interests of the people prioritized. The reason for this is simple. Our political leaders no longer work for us. Instead of being a government of, for, and by the people, America has become a government of the donor class, private industry, and their lobbyists. We aren't even on the radar. Money has so infected our politics, it's virtually all that matters now in terms of policy. The will of the people is entirely tangential because our representatives in Washington are purchased outright and in plain sight. In 2012, House candidates who spent the most money on their elections won 95% of the time. Now, there's no causal link, and there are other variables. But that statistic is not something any incumbent or challenger can ignore. In 2000, outside expenditures totaled roughly $50 million. By 2012, that number had risen to more than 10 times that amount. The total cost of the 2018 midterms is said to be roughly $5 billion, though that encompasses all spending. The point is, there's just too much money here. And as wealth accumulates among the already rich, things look even more bleak. A 2014 Princeton study showed that the likelihood of average citizens getting their way on matters of public policy was roughly 30%, regardless of the level of public support for any given policy. In other words, if a policy had 90% of the public support, the policy still only had a 30% chance of being adopted. If a policy had 2% of the public support, the policy still had a 30% chance of being adopted. But that only applies to the bottom 90% of earners. For the top 10%, things look very different. If a policy has 90% support among the top 10%, the likelihood of that policy being adopted was well over 50%, going as high as 61% in some cases. And if only 2% of the top 10% supported a policy, there was roughly a 2% chance of that policy being adopted. These people get their way more often than not. When those of us in the middle and lower classes don't share the views of upper earners and corporations, we lose, regardless of how many of us there are in agreement. It's actually a little worse than that, because the interest groups wielding the most power are more often than not actually opposed to the preferences of the majority. That's why things like universal background checks for those purchasing firearms can have 90% of public support and go nowhere. If we ever again hope to be a government of, for, and by the people, this will have to change. I'm me. Thanks for watching.